So, Harry had no word from any of his wizarding friends for 5 long weeks, and this summer was turning out to be almost as hard as the last one. There was just one very small improvement. After swearing that he wouldn't use her to send letters to any of his friends, Harry had been allowed to let his owl Hedwig out at night. Uncle Vernon had given in because of the racket Hedwig made as she was locked in her cage all the time. Harry finished writing about Wendelin the Weird and paused to listen again. The silence in the dark house was broken only by the distant grunting snores of his enormous cousin Dudley. It must be very late. Harry's eyes were itching with tiredness. Perhaps he'd finish this essay tomorrow night. He replaced the top of the ink bottle, pulled on an old pillowcase from under his bed, put the torch, a history of magic, his essay, quill, and ink inside it, got out of bed, and hid the lot under a loose floorboard under his bed. Then he stood up, stretched, and checked the time on the luminous alarm clock on his bedside table. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. Harry's stomach gave a funny jolt. He had been 13 years old, without realizing it, for a whole hour. Yet another unusual thing about Harry was how little that he looked forward to his birthdays. He had never received a birthday card in his life. The Dursleys had completely ignored it, his last 2 birthdays, and he had no reason to suppose that they would remember this one. Harry walked across the dark room, past Hedwig's large empty cage, to the open window. He leant on the sill, and the cool night air, pleasant on his face after a long time under the blankets. Hedwig had been absent for 2 nights now. Harry wasn't worried about her. She had been gone this long before, but he'd hoped that she'd come back soon. She was the only living creature in this house who didn't flinch at the sight of him. Harry, though still rather small and skinny for his age, had grown a few inches over the last year. His jet-black hair, however, was just as it always had been, stubbornly untidy, whatever he did to it. The eyes behind his glasses were bright green, and on his forehead, nearly clearly visible through his hair, was a thin scar, shaped like a bolt of lightning. Of all the unusual things about Harry, this scar was the most extraordinary of all. It was not, as the Dursleys had pretended for 10 years, a souvenir of the car crash that had killed Harry's parents. Because Lily and James Potter had not died in a car crash, they had been murdered by the most feared dark wizard for 100 years, Lord Voldemort. Harry had escaped from the same attack with nothing more than a scar on his forehead. When Voldemort's curse, instead of killing him, had rebounded upon its originator, barely alive, Voldemort had fled. But Harry had come face to face with him since at Hogwarts. Remembering their last meeting, as he stood at the dark window, Harry had to admit that he was lucky even to have reached his 13th birthday. He scanned the starry sky for a sign of Hedwig, perhaps soaring back to him with a dead mouse dangling from her beak, expecting praise. Gazing absently over the rooftops, it was a few seconds before Harry realized what he was seeing. Silhouetted amongst the golden moon and growing larger every moment was a large, strangely lopsided creature, and it was flapping in Harry's direction. He stood quite still, watching it sink lower and lower. For a split second he hesitated, his hand on the window latch, wondering whether to slam it shut. But then the bizarre creature soared over one of the street lamps of Privet Drive, and Harry, realizing what it was, leapt aside. Through the window soared 3 owls, 2 of them holding up the third, which appeared to be unconscious. They landed with a soft plump, flump on Harry's bed, and the middle owl, which was large and gray, keeled right over and lay motionless. There was a large package tied to its legs. Harry recognized the unconscious owl at once. His name was Errol, and he belonged to the Weasley family. Harry dashed to the bed at once, untied the cords around Errol's legs, took off the parcel, and then carried Errol to Hedwig's cage. Errol opened one bleary eye, gave a feeble hoot of thanks, and began to gulp some water. Harry turned back to the remaining owls. One of them, the large snowy female, was his own Hedwig. She, too, was carrying a parcel and looked extremely pleased with herself. She gave Harry an affectionate nip with his ear as he removed her burden, and then flew across the room to join Errol. Harry didn't recognize the third owl, a handsome tawny one, but he knew at once where it had come from, because in addition to a third parcel, it was carrying a letter bearing the Hogwarts crest. When Harry relieved this owl of its post, it ruffled its feathers importantly, stretched its wings, and took off through the window into the night. Harry sat down on his bed, grabbed Errol's package, ripped off the brown paper, and discovered a present wrapped in gold, and his first ever birthday card. Fingers trembling slightly, he opened the envelope. 2 pieces of paper fell out, a letter and a newspaper cutting. The cutting had clearly come from the wizarding newspaper, the Daily Prophet, because the people in the black and white picture were moving. Harry picked up the cutting, smoothed it out, and read, Ministry of Magic Employee Scoops Grand Prize. Arthur Weasley, head of the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office at the Ministry of Magic, has won the annual Daily Prophet Grand Prize Galleon Draw. A delighted Mr. Weasley told the Daily Prophet, We will be spending the gold on a summer holiday in Egypt, where our eldest son Bill works as a curse breaker for Gringotts Wizarding Bank. The Weasley family will be spending a month in Egypt, returning to the start of the school year at Hogwarts, which 5 of the Weasley children currently attend. Harry scanned the moving photograph, and a grin spread across his face as he saw all 9 of the Weasleys waving furiously at him, standing in front of a large pyramid. Plump little Mrs. Weasley, tall, balding Mr. Weasley, 6 sons and 1 daughter, all, though the black and white pictures didn't show it, with flaming red hair.